On the evening of October 3rd, 1987, something occurred at Giovanni's Pizzeria in Skokie, Illinois, that would expose an international arms smuggling network operating in the shadow of O'Hare International Airport. The pizzeria sat on Oakton Street, a commercial corridor that connected residential neighborhoods to the sprawling industrial parks near the airport, and it served a steady flow of families, shift workers, and late-night customers who kept the business running 7 days a week. The location was unremarkable, wedged between a dry cleaner and a hardware store, but what was happening in its delivery radius, hidden among warehouses and freight facilities, was anything but ordinary. And it was uncovered not by federal agents or sophisticated surveillance technology, but by a delivery driver who noticed that the same address kept ordering pizza at unusual hours. The driver was a 24-year-old man named Thomas Rafferty, and he had been working at Giovanni's for just over 2 years while finishing his degree at Northeastern Illinois University. His responsibilities included answering phones, preparing orders, and delivering food throughout a territory that stretched from the residential blocks near campus to the industrial areas flanking the Interstate 94 corridor. It was steady work that paid his rent and left enough time for classes, and he developed the kind of efficiency that came from knowing his routes intimately, understanding which streets had potholes, which buildings had confusing entrances, and which customers tipped well. He was studying criminology, hoping to eventually work in law enforcement or corrections, though he'd told his roommate more than once that the degree was mostly theoretical, and that actual police work probably bore little resemblance to what they discussed in seminar rooms. On that October evening, Thomas received an order just after 10 p.m. for delivery to 2847 Industrial Parkway, an address in the warehouse district approximately 3 miles from the pizzeria. The order was large, 5 pizzas and 2 orders of breadsticks totaling $87.40, which struck Thomas as unusual for several reasons. Warehouse areas typically went quiet after business hours, with most facilities closing by 6 or 7 p.m., and orders from that part of his delivery zone were rare outside of lunch shifts when office workers from the few administrative buildings placed group orders. A late-night order of this size suggested either a business working unusual hours or some kind of gathering, neither of which seemed likely for an industrial park on a Saturday evening. Thomas loaded the order into the insulated delivery bags, confirmed the address on the receipt, and drove east toward the warehouse district. The area was poorly lit compared to the commercial streets closer to the pizzeria, with sodium vapor lamps casting orange pools of light at wide intervals along roads lined with chain-link fencing and concrete loading docks. Most of the buildings were dark, their parking lots empty except for the occasional semi-trailer parked overnight. When Thomas arrived at 2847 Industrial Parkway, he found a nondescript warehouse, single-story with corrugated metal siding and a flat roof, identical in appearance to dozens of others in the area. The building was well lit, with floodlights illuminating the loading dock area, and a small sign near the entrance read Baltic Trading Company in simple block letters with no additional information about what the company imported or exported. Thomas parked near the loading dock and carried the pizzas to a steel door marked Deliveries. He knocked twice and waited, aware of the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of traffic from the interstate. The door opened after approximately 15 seconds, and a man in his early 40s stood in the doorway. He was wearing a dark business suit and tie, which seemed unusual for someone working in a warehouse on a Saturday night, and he looked at Thomas with an expression that suggested mild impatience rather than the casual friendliness most customers displayed when their food arrived. The man asked how much he owed, and Thomas told him $87.40. The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a leather wallet, and counted out exact change, 4 20s, 1 5, 2 1s, and 40 cents in quarters. He took the pizzas without asking for a receipt, thanked Thomas in a voice that carried a faint accent Thomas couldn't quite place, and began to close the door. But in the brief moment before the door shut completely, Thomas caught a glimpse of the interior of the warehouse. He saw 3 other men standing near a folding table, all wearing business attire similar to the man who'd answered the door, and he heard voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize, but that sounded vaguely Eastern European, possibly Russian or Polish or Czech. Beyond the men, he saw several wooden crates stacked against the far wall, each approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, with stenciled markings on the sides that looked like military-style shipping codes, numbers and letters in a format he'd seen in documentaries about logistics and supply chains. The door closed, and Thomas walked back to his car, feeling a slight sense of unease that he couldn't immediately explain. He drove back to Giovanni's and mentioned the delivery to Franco Giovanni, the owner, who was working the counter that evening. Franco listened and shrugged, suggesting that maybe it was a company working late on inventory or preparing for a Monday shipment. Nothing particularly unusual for businesses in that area. Thomas agreed that was probably the explanation, and moved on to his next delivery. And by the end of his shift, the incident had faded into the routine background of the evening. But 3 weeks later, on October 24th, it happened again. Thomas had delivered to 2847 Industrial Parkway 4 times by late October, and the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Each delivery occurred between 9:30 and 10:45 p.m., always on a weekend, always a large order totaling between $80 and $95, and always answered by a different man in business attire who paid in exact cash and showed no interest in receipts or small talk. On the 4th delivery, Thomas had arrived early enough to see 3 luxury vehicles parked near the loading dock. A Mercedes sedan with diplomatic plates, a late-model BMW, and a white panel van with commercial registration. The combination struck him as odd, the kind of detail that didn't fit the profile of a legitimate import-export business working late hours on inventory management. He mentioned it to his roommate that evening, a man named David Chen, who worked as an enforcement officer for the United States Customs Service at O'Hare International Airport. David was in the kitchen making coffee when Thomas came home from his shift, and Thomas described the deliveries in detail, the timing, the men in suits, the wooden crates he'd glimpsed with military-style stenciling. David listened carefully, asked Thomas to describe the crates more precisely, and when Thomas mentioned that they were approximately 3 feet by 2 feet with alphanumeric codes stenciled on the sides, David's expression shifted from casual interest to something more focused. David explained that the dimensions and markings Thomas had described matched the format used for military shipping containers, the kind used to transport weapons components or sensitive equipment through international logistics networks. He asked whether Thomas had seen any other details, company names, country of origin markings, anything that might indicate what the crates contained or where they'd come from. Thomas said he hadn't been able to see clearly enough, that the door had closed too quickly, but that on one delivery he'd heard the men inside speaking what sounded like a Slavic language, possibly Czech or Polish, based on the phonetic patterns he'd noticed. The following morning, David ran the warehouse address through the Customs Service database at work. The search returned a business registration for Baltic Trading Company, licensed for import and export operations, with a primary business classification listed as agricultural equipment and industrial machinery. The company had been operating since March 1985, and the listed owner was a man named Eric Volkov, a naturalized United States citizen who had immigrated from Estonia in 1979. The business appeared legitimate on paper, with proper licensing, regular tax filings, and no record of customs violations or flagged shipments. But David knew from his work at O'Hare that agricultural equipment was a common cover classification for smuggling operations, vague enough to justify large crates and heavy cargo while avoiding the scrutiny that items like electronics or chemicals would trigger. David contacted his supervisor, Special Agent Linda Morrison, and briefed her on what Thomas had observed. Morrison had been with Customs for 11 years and had worked multiple cases involving arms trafficking through Midwest airports, which served as convenient transit points for smuggling networks that wanted to avoid the heavier enforcement presence at coastal ports. She reviewed the information David had compiled on Baltic Trading Company and cross-referenced it with recent intelligence bulletins from the CIA and FBI regarding Eastern European arms dealers using commercial fronts to move weapons through the United States to third-party buyers in conflict zones. The timing was significant. The Iran-Contra affair had been exposed less than a year earlier, and federal agencies were on heightened alert for similar networks operating outside official channels. Morrison made the decision to bring the FBI into the investigation. Arms trafficking fell under the jurisdiction of multiple agencies: Customs for import violations, ATF for weapons-related crimes, and FBI for counterintelligence and national security matters, but the potential involvement of foreign nationals suggested this might extend beyond simple smuggling. She contacted the FBI's Chicago field office and spoke with Special Agent Robert Kellerman, a veteran investigator who specialized in illegal arms transfers and had worked cases involving Eastern European networks since the early 1980s. Kellerman reviewed Morrison's briefing and agreed that the pattern warranted further investigation, particularly the detail about diplomatic plates on one of the vehicles Thomas had seen, which suggested possible involvement of foreign government officials or intelligence operatives. The decision was made to have Thomas continue making deliveries to the warehouse while documenting everything he observed. Morrison and Kellerman met with Thomas on October 27th at the customs office near O'Hare, and they explained that his observations had uncovered what might be a significant smuggling operation. They instructed him to deliver orders normally, to avoid doing anything that would appear suspicious or out of character, and to note specific details, vehicle license plates, physical descriptions of the men he encountered, any visible documentation or paperwork, and anything he heard during the brief interactions at the door. They emphasized that he should not take unnecessary risks, that his role was simply to observe and report, and that trained agents would handle any enforcement actions if the investigation produced sufficient evidence. On October 31st, Halloween night, Giovanni's received another order for 2,847 Industrial Parkway. The order came in at 9:15 p.m., 6 pizzas and an order of garlic bread, and Thomas immediately called David to relay the information. David contacted Morrison, who activated a surveillance plan that had been prepared over the previous 3 days. Thomas loaded the delivery into his car and drove toward the warehouse district, aware that federal agents were now positioned in unmarked vehicles throughout the area, watching and waiting for whatever would unfold that evening. The FBI surveillance operation began in earnest on November 2, 1987, 3 days after Thomas's Halloween delivery to the warehouse. Special Agent Kellerman had assembled a task force that included 4 FBI agents, 2 customs officers, and support personnel from the Chicago Police Department who would provide perimeter coverage if arrests became necessary. The team met at the FBI field office on West Roosevelt Road to review what they knew and to develop a strategy for gathering evidence that would support federal charges. Kellerman explained that Thomas's observations were valuable, but not sufficient for a search warrant, that they needed either physical evidence of illegal weapons or documented proof that Baltic Trading Company was importing items that violated the Arms Export Control Act. The Customs Service portion of the investigation focused on Baltic Trading's import history over the previous 18 months. Agent Morrison and her team pulled shipping manifests, customs declarations, and payment records for every container that had entered the United States under the company's name since January 1986. What they found was a pattern that appeared legal on paper, but raised significant questions when examined more closely. Baltic Trading had imported 43 shipments during that period, all declared as agricultural equipment or industrial machinery parts, originating from Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. The declared weights of these shipments were inconsistent with the items listed on the manifests. A container listed as containing tractor components weighed substantially more than comparable agricultural equipment typically weighed, and several shipments declared as industrial drill parts had weights that suggested much denser materials than steel or aluminum. Morrison contacted freight forwarders and shipping companies that had handled Baltic Trading's cargo, requesting copies of the original bills of lading and warehouse receipts. Most of the shipments had transited through Amsterdam or Frankfurt before arriving at O'Hare, a routing that was common for goods moving from Eastern Europe to the United States, but that also served as a convenient way to obscure the true origin of materials. Transshipment through Western European ports made it more difficult for customs officials to trace cargo back to its source, and reduced scrutiny because items arriving from NATO countries typically received less intensive inspection than those coming directly from Warsaw Pact nations. While Morrison worked the paper trail, Kellerman's team established physical surveillance on the warehouse at 2847 Industrial Parkway. Agents rotated shifts in unmarked vehicles, positioned at locations that provided clear sight lines to the building's entrance and loading dock. They documented every vehicle that arrived, photographing license plates and recording the time and duration of each visit. Over the course of 5 days, they observed a steady pattern of activity. The warehouse remained dark and apparently empty during normal business hours, but between 7 p.m. and midnight, vehicles would arrive, luxury sedans and panel vans, and men would enter through the loading dock entrance. The visits typically lasted between 30 minutes and 2 hours, and the men who arrived dressed in business attire, not the kind of clothing associated with warehouse work or freight handling. On November 7th, surveillance teams documented the arrival of a cargo shipment at O'Hare from Amsterdam. Customs officers monitoring international freight noticed that the shipment was consigned to Baltic Trading Company, and that the manifest listed the contents as agricultural machinery parts weighing approximately 2,400 pounds, distributed across 4 wooden crates. The shipment cleared customs without inspection because the paperwork appeared legitimate, and because agricultural equipment imports from Western Europe were considered low risk. Customs officers photographed the crates as they were loaded onto a panel van in the cargo terminal, and surveillance teams followed the van as it drove directly to the warehouse on Industrial Parkway. The van entered through the loading dock at 6:47 a.m., and the door closed behind it. Kellerman faced a decision that would determine the course of the investigation. He could request a search warrant based on the circumstantial evidence they had accumulated, the suspicious import patterns, the late-night activity, Thomas's observations of military-style crates, but federal judges typically required more concrete probable cause before authorizing searches of commercial properties. Alternatively, he could continue surveillance and wait for an opportunity to observe direct evidence of illegal activity, which carried the risk that weapons, if that's what the crates contained, might be distributed to buyers before agents could intervene. The decision was complicated by the fact that they still had no definitive proof that Baltic Trading was doing anything illegal. Importing agricultural equipment wasn't a crime, and meeting with business associates at unusual hours, while suspicious, wasn't sufficient grounds for a raid. Kellerman chose to wait and to hope that another opportunity would present itself. He instructed surveillance teams to maintain their positions and to document everything. Every vehicle, every person, every movement of cargo in or out of the building. He also asked Morrison to contact Thomas and inform him that if Giovanni's received another delivery order for the warehouse, Thomas should notify them immediately. The plan was to use the delivery as a pretext for getting closer to the building, for potentially seeing inside again, and for gathering audio or visual evidence that would justify a search warrant. It was a calculated gamble, one that depended on the smuggling network maintaining its pattern of ordering pizza during late-night meetings. On November 14th, the gamble paid off. Giovanni's Pizzeria received a call at 9:02 p.m. requesting delivery to 2847 Industrial Parkway, and Thomas immediately contacted Agent Morrison, who activated the surveillance teams and notified Kellerman that the opportunity they'd been waiting for had arrived. The FBI's mobile command post was a converted panel van parked 2 blocks from Baltic Trading Company, equipped with radio equipment and recording devices that would monitor Thomas's wired transmission. Agent Kellerman and Agent Morrison were inside the van along with a technical specialist who would manage the audio feed, and they had positioned 3 additional surveillance vehicles at strategic points around the warehouse, ready to move if the situation escalated beyond a simple delivery. Thomas arrived at the command post at 9:25 p.m., and the technical specialist fitted him with a wire, a small microphone taped to his chest beneath his Giovanni's Pizzeria work shirt and connected to a transmitter clipped to his belt. The device would broadcast everything Thomas heard to the FBI team, and the recording would serve as evidence if the investigation proceeded to prosecution. Morrison gave Thomas explicit instructions before he left for the delivery. He was to approach the warehouse exactly as he had on previous deliveries, knock on the door, hand over the pizzas, collect payment, and leave. If he saw weapons clearly visible inside the building, he was to say the phrase, "I threw in extra garlic bread," which would signal agents to move immediately. If he felt threatened or unsafe at any point, he was to say, "Do you need Parmesan?" and the FBI would intervene within seconds. Morrison emphasized that Thomas's safety was the priority, that gathering evidence was important but not worth risking his life, and that he should trust his instincts about when to leave. Thomas nodded and said he understood, though his hands were shaking slightly as he carried the pizzas back to his car. He drove the familiar route to Industrial Parkway, and the FBI surveillance teams followed at a distance, maintaining radio contact with the command post. Thomas arrived at the warehouse at 9:38 p.m. and immediately noticed that the building was more brightly lit than it had been during previous deliveries. Floodlights illuminated the entire loading dock area, and he could see 2 vehicles parked near the entrance, a dark Mercedes sedan and the white panel van he'd seen before. He parked his car in the same spot he always used, grabbed the insulated delivery bag containing 5 pizzas, and walked toward the steel door marked Deliveries. His heart was beating rapidly, and he was acutely aware of the wire beneath his shirt and the FBI agents listening to every sound he made. Thomas knocked twice on the door and waited. The audio feed transmitted the sound of his knocking clearly to the command post, followed by approximately 10 seconds of silence before the door opened. The man who answered was younger than the individuals Thomas had encountered on previous deliveries, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and a heavier build. He spoke with a distinct Russian accent, asking Thomas if he had the pizzas and how much they cost. Thomas told him $93.50, and the man nodded. But instead of pulling out cash, he said that Thomas should come inside because the others had the money and would pay him directly. Thomas hesitated, explaining that customers usually paid at the door, and the man replied that it was cold outside, and that Thomas should come in quickly so they could close the door. In the FBI command post, Morrison and Kellerman exchanged tense glances. This was a deviation from the established pattern, and it placed Thomas in a more vulnerable position than they had anticipated. Morrison spoke into her radio, instructing all teams to be ready to move, and Kellerman listened intently to the audio feed as Thomas's voice came through the speakers, saying that he supposed that would be fine, and that he'd come inside for just a moment. Thomas entered the warehouse, and the door closed behind him. Through the wire, the FBI team heard multiple voices speaking in English and Russian, and they heard the sound of Thomas's footsteps on the concrete floor. Thomas saw 8 men gathered around a folding table covered with documents and coffee cups, and all conversation stopped when he walked into the room. The men were wearing business attire, dress shirts, and slacks, and several of them looked at Thomas with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to something closer to suspicion. One man, older than the others and clearly in a position of authority, asked Thomas in accented English how much he owed for the pizzas. Thomas repeated the amount, $93.50, and watched as the older man reached into his pocket and began counting bills. While the man counted, Thomas scanned the room as casually as he could, trying not to appear too interested in his surroundings. His gaze fell on a wooden crate positioned near the far wall, partially opened with packing straw visible around the edges. One of the men standing near the table shifted his position, and Thomas saw what was inside the crate. It was a metallic tube approximately 4 feet in length with distinctive stabilizing fins at one end, a design Thomas recognized from photographs he'd seen in his criminology textbooks and from documentaries about military weapons. It was a missile launcher, a man-portable surface-to-air system designed to target aircraft. Thomas forced himself to look away and accepted the cash from the older man, counting it quickly and asking if they needed plates or napkins or anything else. The older man said no, that everything was fine, and told Thomas he should leave now. But one of the younger men had been watching Thomas closely, and he said something in Russian to the older man, gesturing toward Thomas with a slight nod. The older man's expression changed, his eyes narrowing slightly, and he asked Thomas if he had delivered to this address before. Thomas said yes a few times, that they ordered a lot, and he remembered the location. The older man stepped closer, and Thomas could feel the tension in the room shift, the casual atmosphere evaporating into something harder and more focused. The older man asked Thomas what he had seen, and Thomas maintained what he hoped was a neutral expression, saying he'd seen pizza, just the delivery, nothing special. Then, keeping his voice as steady as possible, he added that he'd thrown in extra garlic bread, no charge for that. In the FBI command post, Morrison immediately spoke into her radio, ordering all teams to move. Thomas, following the script he'd been given, asked if anyone needed Parmesan cheese, and the second signal triggered a coordinated response from agents positioned around the warehouse. The older man told Thomas that perhaps they would use a different restaurant for future orders, and Thomas was preparing to respond when the sound of vehicles arrived outside, tires screeching against pavement and doors slamming. The men inside the warehouse reacted immediately, several of them shouting in Russian while others moved toward the back of the building as if searching for an alternate exit. Thomas dropped the pizza boxes and hit the floor as Agent Morrison had instructed, covering his head with his arms. The steel door crashed open, and FBI agents flooded into the warehouse with weapons drawn, shouting commands for everyone to show their hands and get on the ground. Within 90 seconds, all 8 men were detained, hands secured behind their backs with plastic zip ties, and Thomas was escorted out of the building by 2 agents who confirmed he was unharmed before walking him back to the command post. Agent Kellerman entered the warehouse once the scene was secured and began directing the evidence collection process. Forensic technicians photographed every surface, every document, every item visible in the space, establishing a visual record that would be used during prosecution. The 4 wooden crates that had arrived from Amsterdam were opened systematically, and what they contained confirmed the worst suspicions of the investigation. Inside were 12-9 K-32 Strela 2 missile launchers, Soviet-manufactured weapons known to NATO forces as SA-7 systems, designed to be carried and operated by a single person to target low-flying aircraft. The weapons were fully functional, complete with guidance systems, battery packs, and launch mechanisms, and they represented a significant threat to civilian aviation if they reached the buyers for whom they were intended. In addition to the missile launchers, agents found technical documentation written in Russian and English that explained operating procedures and maintenance requirements. They found shipping manifests that had been falsified to describe the crates' contents as agricultural equipment, specifically tractor hydraulic components, and they found end-user certificates that purported to show the weapons were being sold to a legitimate agricultural cooperative in Honduras, documents that would later be determined to be sophisticated forgeries. Financial records recovered from a filing cabinet in a small office area revealed wire transfers from bank accounts in Panama and Cyprus totaling more than $800,000 over the previous 14 months, payments that appeared to correspond with previous weapons shipments that had successfully reached buyers. The most significant discovery, from an intelligence perspective, was a handwritten list of contacts and delivery locations found in a leather portfolio belonging to the older man who had questioned Thomas. The list included names and addresses in Nicaragua, Afghanistan, and Angola, regions where insurgent groups were known to be operating and where surface-to-air missiles would be highly valued for attacking government aircraft and supply helicopters. There were also maps of Central American airfields marked with annotations about flight patterns and security procedures, information that would be useful to anyone planning attacks on civilian or military aviation targets. The 8 men who had been arrested were separated and transported to the FBI field office for individual interrogations. The older man, who had been in charge of the operation, was identified through fingerprint analysis as Viktor Petrov, a former Soviet military officer who had immigrated to the United States in 1979 and obtained citizenship in 1984. His background check revealed prior service in the Soviet Army's logistics division, where he would have had extensive knowledge of weapons systems and international arms trade networks. When interrogated, Petrov initially refused to answer questions and demanded to speak with an attorney, but several of the younger men, when confronted with evidence and informed of the potential sentences they faced under federal espionage and arms trafficking statutes, agreed to cooperate with investigators. Through these interrogations, conducted over several days in November 1987, a pattern emerged that explained how the smuggling operation had functioned. Baltic Trading Company had been established as a front organization, specifically for the purpose of moving weapons from Eastern European sources into the United States, where they would be stored temporarily before being transshipped to buyers in conflict zones. The weapons were sourced from Warsaw Pact nations where surplus military equipment could be legally purchased as decommissioned or obsolete materiel, though the items Baltic Trading acquired were in fact fully operational and deadly. The weapons were then transported to Western European ports, primarily Amsterdam and Frankfurt, where they were relabeled and provided with falsified customs documentation describing them as agricultural or industrial equipment. This transshipment through NATO countries was deliberate and strategic. Customs officials at United States ports of entry were less likely to scrutinize cargo arriving from allied nations, and the additional step made it more difficult to trace the weapons back to their actual origin. A corrupt freight forwarder in Amsterdam, who was later identified and arrested by Dutch authorities, had facilitated the falsification of shipping documents and had ensured that containers passed through customs checkpoints without detailed physical inspection. Once the weapons arrived at O'Hare, they were transported to the warehouse on Industrial Parkway, where they remained until buyers could arrange payment and transportation to final destinations. The network had been operating for approximately 18 months before Thomas noticed the unusual late-night pizza deliveries, and during that time it had successfully moved an estimated 47 missile launchers, several hundred small arms, and substantial quantities of ammunition and explosives. The total value of weapons that had passed through Baltic Trading Company was estimated at $4.3 million, and the potential damage those weapons could have caused, in terms of lives lost and aircraft destroyed, was incalculable. Agent Kellerman, in his official report on the investigation, noted that the network represented a sophisticated and well-financed operation that had exploited weaknesses in international shipping procedures and customs enforcement, and that its disruption had likely prevented numerous attacks on civilian and military aviation. The federal grand jury convened in December 1987 and returned indictments against all 8 men arrested at the warehouse on Industrial Parkway. The charges included conspiracy to violate the Arms Export Control Act, smuggling, wire fraud, and for Viktor Petrov specifically, operating as an unregistered agent of a foreign power. The trial was scheduled to begin in March 1988, and federal prosecutors spent the intervening months building a case that relied heavily on the physical evidence seized from the warehouse, the financial records documenting wire transfers from foreign accounts, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses who described in detail how the smuggling network had functioned. Thomas Rafferty was subpoenaed to testify about his observations during the deliveries and about what he had seen inside the warehouse on the night of November 14th, testimony that would prove crucial in establishing that the defendants had been in possession of operational weapons systems rather than deactivated training equipment, which the defense attorneys attempted to argue. The trial proceeded over 6 weeks in the spring of 1988, with prosecutors presenting forensic evidence, customs records, and expert testimony from military weapons specialists who confirmed that the seized missile launchers were fully functional and capable of destroying aircraft. Defense attorneys argued that their clients had been misled about the nature of the items they were handling, that they believed they were importing legitimate surplus military equipment for collectors and museums, but this argument was undermined by the financial records showing payments from known arms brokers and by the maps and contact lists found in Petrov's possession that clearly indicated the weapons were destined for conflict zones. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major counts for all 8 defendants. Viktor Petrov was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, a term that reflected both the severity of his crimes and his role as the leader of the operation. The other 7 defendants received sentences ranging from 12 to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement and their cooperation with investigators. Judge Patricia Hammond, who presided over the sentencing hearing, stated that the defendants had endangered American national security and had facilitated violence in regions already devastated by conflict, and that the court had a responsibility to impose sentences that would deter others from engaging in similar criminal enterprises. Thomas Rafferty completed his criminology degree in the spring of 1988, and his role in exposing the arms smuggling network became public during the trial when local news organizations covered the proceedings. He was approached by multiple federal agencies offering positions in law enforcement, including the FBI, Customs Service, and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. He chose to join the Customs Service, influenced partly by his roommate David Chen's career path, and partly by his interest in the investigative work involved in monitoring international trade and preventing smuggling. He specialized in export control violations and became an instructor at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, where he taught courses on pattern recognition and observation techniques, using his own experience as a teaching example of how ordinary citizens could contribute to national security by paying attention to activities that didn't fit normal patterns. The investigation into Baltic Trading Company expanded to other cities after agents analyzed the network's financial records and identified similar operations in Miami, Los Angeles, and Houston. Additional arrests were made over the following year, resulting in the seizure of 47 missile launchers in total, hundreds of small arms, and substantial quantities of explosives that had been destined for buyers in Central America, the Middle East, and Africa. Congressional hearings were held to examine how weapons had entered the United States undetected and to identify weaknesses in customs procedures that had allowed the smuggling to continue for 18 months. The hearings resulted in reforms that enhanced scrutiny of agricultural equipment imports from Eastern Europe and improved coordination between federal agencies responsible for monitoring arms trafficking. Giovanni's Pizzeria experienced a brief surge in attention after the trial, with customers visiting specifically because they wanted to see the restaurant where the investigation had begun. Franco Giovanni, the owner, had mixed feelings about the publicity, concerned that it would change the character of his business, but he was proud of Thomas and displayed a framed newspaper article about the case on the wall near the cash register. The restaurant continued operating in Skokie until Franco retired in 2003, and regular customers would occasionally point out the article to newcomers and explain that their delivery driver had helped stop an international arms smuggling ring. Agent Robert Kellerman, in an interview conducted in 1995 for a training video used at the FBI Academy, reflected on the investigation and emphasized that Thomas Rafferty represented exactly what federal law enforcement needed from the public, which was awareness and willingness to report suspicious activity. Kellerman noted that Thomas hadn't been trained in counterintelligence or weapons identification, but he had understood that patterns matter, that a warehouse in an industrial park didn't need 5 large pizzas delivered at 10:30 p.m. 4 times in 6 weeks, and that this deviation from normal business behavior warranted attention. Thomas himself, when asked years later about his role in the investigation, remained modest, stating that he had simply been trying to finish his degree and pay his rent, and that he hadn't set out to become involved in a federal case. But when he saw the wooden crates and heard the foreign conversations, and noticed the expensive cars at a warehouse that supposedly imported agricultural equipment, he knew something was wrong, and he trusted that instinct enough to report it. The arms smuggling operation had been sophisticated, well-financed, and international in scope, involving corrupt officials in multiple countries and exploiting weaknesses in customs enforcement that had existed for years. But it was dismantled because a pizza delivery driver noticed that the same address kept ordering food at unusual hours, and he decided that was worth a second look.